What's up, guys? This is part two of the Olaf Hansen story from the book The Smoky God. And just a quick recap, this was written by George Willis Emerson, a Chicago newspaperman who claims that this Olaf Hansen came to him with this story at 95 years of age and wanted it to be known to the world, but not until he had passed away, because he had earlier in life, after this journey, told his story to the authorities, and he spent 28 years locked up. Fool me once and whatnot. Janssen claims to have started his trip with his father in the spring of 1829 out of Stockholm. They went to Hammerfest, Norway, up to the Franz Josef Islands, and when they got around to the north side, they had nothing but clear, calm waters to the north of them and intermittent icebergs to the east and west. Now, this was the far north, and this was evidently the first time his father had ever seen anything like this. And he asked him, he said, "Son, will you sail with me to the north? This is the place of legends." They go for it, and they get caught up in a pretty nasty snowstorm, basically make it through unscathed, lose some of their food rations, and we're down to 2 casks of water. Eventually, they figure out that they're actually sailing through fresh water. And at one point, the needle of the compass gets pinned against the glass, and they actually have to tilt the compass some in order for it to spin level again. Finally, they see what they think is a false sun. It was a mirage, red, hazy sun. And it began to be seen every day for 12 hours of the day. And they said it looked like it was eclipsed for 12 hours a day, the way they described it. We're blowing right through things, but this was a 5-month journey. And finally, they find land again, spot a huge river going inland, and start sailing 10 days up it. There's gigantic trees that they say make the California redwoods look like underbrush. Then they hear singing, and a huge ship is coming down the river. As soon as Olaf and his father are spotted, the ship sends a skiff and an entourage over to meet them, and they're all 12-foot tall giants. Olaf describes these giants as being a product of good breeding, meaning these were high-class gentlemen, ladies, and they treat them very courteously. They invite Olaf and his father to come with them on their ship. They agree, and this is a huge ship with hundreds of people. They said 12 to 15 feet tall, and they just threw a line down and picked up their little sloop and set it on the deck like a curiosity, quote. Now, this ship is propelled by what Olaf figures later in life is electricity, because he didn't know what electricity was in 1829. But he said it was noiseless and just something he had never experienced before. They make it to a port city named Jihu, spend a year there, learn the language of the giants, which later in life he learns is similar to Sanskrit. And we pick up the story here. After we had given an account of ourselves to the emissaries from the central seat of government in the inner continent, and my father had, in his crude way, drawn maps of the outside surface of the earth, showing the divisions of land and water and giving the names of each of the continents, large islands, and oceans, we were taken overland to the city of Eden, in a conveyance different from anything we have in Europe or America. This vehicle was doubtless some electrical contrivance. It was noiseless and ran on a single iron rail in perfect balance. The trip was made at a very high rate of speed. We were carried up and down hills and again along the sides of steep mountains without any apparent attempt having been made to level the earth as we do for our railroad tracks. The car seats were huge yet comfortable affairs and very high above the floor of the car. That's kind of funny. You're like a kid in a booster chair. It's all these seats made for 12 feet tall people. On the top of each car were high-geared flywheels laying on their sides, which were so automatically adjusted that as the speed of the car increased, the high speed of these flywheels geometrically increased. Jules, the one that had taught them to speak their language, explained to us that these revolving fan-like wheels on top of the cars destroyed atmospheric pressure, or what is generally understood by the term gravitation. The city of Eden is located in what seems to be a beautiful valley, yet in fact is one of the loftiest mountain plateaus of the inner continent, several thousand feet higher than any portion of the surrounding country. It is the most beautiful place I've ever beheld in all my travels. In this elevated garden, all manner of fruits, vines, shrubs, trees, and flowers grow in riotous profusion. In this garden, 4 rivers have their source in a mighty artesian fountain. They divide and flow in 4 directions. This place is called by the inhabitants the navel of the earth, or the beginning, the cradle of the human race. The names of the rivers are the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel, however you say it. Now, this is exactly the same as what's described in the book of Genesis, and what a lot of people might not know is that the Hindu have the exact same mythology of the cradle of civilization, and their temples even symbolize this North Pole Eden. Anyway, the surprise of my father and myself was indescribable when, amid the real magnificence of a spacious hall, we were finally brought before the great high priest, ruler over all the land. He was richly robed and even taller than those around him, and could not have been less than 14 or 15 feet in height. We were given an audience of over 2 hours with this great dignitary, who seemed kindly disposed and considerate. At the conclusion of our interview, he inquired our pleasure, asking us whether we wished to remain in his country or if we preferred to return to the outer world, providing it were even possible to make a successful return trip. My father replied, "It would please me and my son to visit your country and see your people, your colleges, your palaces of music and art, your great fields, your wonderful forests of timber, and after we've had this privilege, to return to our home on the outside surface." The chief high priest replied, "I fear you may never return, because the way is a most hazard one. However, you shall visit the different countries with Jules as your escort, and when you're ready to attempt your return voyage, I assure you that your boat shall be here in the waters of the river." Thus terminated our only interview with the high priest or ruler of this continent. Part 4, in the underworld. We learn that the males do not marry before they are from 75 to 100 years old, and that the age at which women enter into wedlock is only a little less, and that both men and women frequently live to be from 600 to 800 years old, and in some instances much older. And there is an author's footnote here that says, God prolonged the life of the patriarchs that preceded the deluge, the great flood, both on account of their virtues and to give them the opportunity of perfecting the sciences. Geometry and astronomy, which they had discovered, they could not have done had they not lived 600 years, because it is only after the lapse of 600 years that the great year is accomplished. Evidently, in the last world age, in the time of Noah, and what he's saying is the patriarchs, they lived to be, 800, 900 years old in some cases. And it's interesting that he places geometry that far back in time, and then also astronomy is usually considered a forbidden art, And hey, what if these are people from 5,000 years ago that were 12 foot tall, lived to be 1,000 years old, and before something bad happened, they all took to the inner earth. So they visited a few cities, and then he says, in our travels we came to a forest of gigantic trees near the city of Delphi. Had the Bible said there were trees towering over 300 feet in height and more than 30 feet in diameter growing in the Garden of Eden, the Ingersolls, the Tom Paines, and the Voltaires would doubtly have pronounced that a statement of myth. Yet this is the description of the California Sequoia gigantea. But these California giants pale in significance when compared with the forest of Goliath found within the continent. where abound mighty trees from 800 to 1,000 feet in height and from 100 to 120 feet in diameter, countless in numbers and forming forests extending hundreds of miles back from the sea. The people are exceedingly musical and learned to a remarkable degree in their arts and sciences. Their cities are equipped with vast palaces of music, where not infrequently as many as 25,000 lusty voices of this giant race swell forth in mighty choruses of the most sublime symphonies. You know, it bothers me that every single culture on earth, up until recently, all had songs of their people and their culture that they would all sing together. It's a bonding experience, you know. You still see it in some cultures, and, you know, some countries have their soccer chants that they'll all sing, but they have gotten rid of all of that on purpose to keep us divided. I mean, seriously, imagine a spontaneous sing-along anywhere under any settings today, where 100 years ago it was normal, and it has been for thousands of years. Anyway, the children are not supposed to attend institutions of learning before they are 20 years old, and then their school life begins and continues for 30 years, 10 of which are uniformly devoted by both sexes to the study of music. Their principal vocations are architecture, agriculture, horticulture, the raising of vast herds of cattle, and the building of conveyances peculiar to that country for travel on land and water. By some device which I cannot explain, they hold communion with one another between the most distant parts of their country on air currents, so wireless communications technologies. About 3/4 of the inner surface of the earth is land and about 1/4 water. So he's describing the exact opposite of what we've got on the outside. There are numerous rivers of tremendous size, some flowing in a northerly direction and others southerly. Some of these rivers are 30 miles in width, and it is out of these vast waterways at the extreme northern and southern parts of the inside surface of the earth, in regions where low temperatures are experienced, that freshwater icebergs are formed. They are then pushed out to sea by turbulent waters that twice every year sweep everything before them. Now, I commented about the freshwater icebergs at the North Pole in the first video, because I'll explain in a minute, but I got an email from Wayne about the South Pole saying that there's freshwater rivers that flow out, but I get this comment from my favorite little 5-foot-tall stripper, Diamond, and I don't know why he's watching a video about Hollow Earth, big brain science guy like that, but apparently I'm clueless for questioning why there's freshwater icebergs at the North Pole. Now, there is not supposed to be any landmass at the North Pole. So, yes, I understand the idea that glaciers form from years and years of accumulated snow. Although that kind of sprained my brain right there. But on the North Pole, there's no landmass for it to gather on. So what is the other choice that it could gather on? Saltwater ice that forms on top of the water. And as any freshwater ice on the top of the iceberg accumulates, it gets heavier, sinks down more, and then next year's accumulation would also include the salt water of the ocean. And I understand salt water is not the same freezing temperature as fresh water, but it gets cold enough for the salt water to form. I've seen it. So yes, I can see the surface of it being a freshwater accumulation of precipitation. However, since there's no landmass for it to accumulate on, I would assume that it has to be accumulating on the saltwater ice, which makes it not a freshwater glacier. Or perhaps Olaf is correct, and these are discharging from rivers on continents on the inside of the Earth. What do you think, Diamond? Sorry, I get those names mixed up. Anyway, continuing on. We saw innumerable specimens of bird life no larger than those encountered in the forests of Europe and America. It is well known that during the last few years, whole species of birds have quit the earth, And even a writer in a recent article wrote, "Is it not possible for these disappearing bird species to quit their habitation without and find asylum in the within world?" This was written in 1922, and something like 60-70% of all bird species have basically disappeared since the 1970s. Now, I've always just assumed that it's due to the pesticides and the electromagnetic interference that we've created in that time frame. And maybe that is the reason instead of them going extinct, though, they all went to the inner earth. Some of the birds appeared to measure about 30 feet from tip to tip of their wings, and upon examining a nest of eggs, there were 5 in the nest, each of which was at least 2 feet in length and 15 inches in diameter. After we had been in the city of Hectea about a week, Professor Galdea took us to an inlet where we saw thousands of tortoises along the sandy shore. I hesitate to state the size of these great creatures. They were from 25 to 30 feet in length and a full 7 feet in height. When one of them projected its head, it had appeared that some hideous sea monster had appeared. One day, we saw a great herd of elephants. There must have been 500 of these thunder-throated monsters with their restless waving trunks. They were tearing huge boughs from trees and trampling smaller growth into dust like so much hazel brush. They would average over 100 feet in length and from 75 to 85 in height. My father held my arm with a prolific grip as if fearful harm would overtake us. We were 2 atoms in this great forest and fortunately unobserved by this vast herd of elephants as they drifted on and away. There is a hazy mist that goes up from the land each evening, and it invariably rains once every 24 hours. This great moisture and the invigorating electrical light and warmth account perhaps for the most luxuriant of vegetation. It's funny that he explains the inner sun, what they call the Smoky God, as an electrical light. And here's a fun fact about the sun. Maybe Diamond, you still listening? You can explain this. It's supposed to be burning hydrogen, right? Only it puts off a white light, and there's nothing that we know of that you can burn to put off every spectrum of light. Anyway, after having spent considerably more than a year in visiting several of the many cities of the within world and a great deal of intervening country, more than 2 years had passed since the time we were picked up by the excursion ship. In part 1, that was their first contact with the inner earth giants. We decided to cast our fortunes once more upon the sea and endeavor to regain the outside surface of the earth. We made known our wishes, and they were reluctantly but promptly followed. Our hosts gave my father, at his request, various maps showing the entire inside surface of the earth, its cities, oceans, seas, rivers, gulfs, and bays. They also generously offered to give us all the bags of gold nuggets, some of them as large as a goose eggs, that we were willing to attempt to take with us in our little fishing boat. After all was in readiness, the same ship Naz that had originally discovered us took us on board and sailed us to the mouth of the river Hiddekill. After our giant brothers had launched our little craft for us, they were most cordially regretful at parting and evinced much solicitude for our safety. My father swore by the gods Odin and Thor that he would surely return again within a year or 2 and pay them another visit. Now, there's about 45 pages of the return journey here. If anyone wants to read it, you can get this on Internet Archive. It's called The Smoky God. And spoiler alert, I'm about to break it all down real quick and easy. They finally got caught up in a storm once they got past the North Pole back on our side of things. They shipwrecked, lost everything, including his father. Olaf survived by floating on an iceberg until another boat saw them. They took him on board, and he told him, the captain, the story of the inner earth, and they locked him in the brig. And then when they got back to port, they just considered him a madman, and he was locked up for 28 years over telling his story. He was released in his 50s and started a small fishing company, eventually moved to America, and that is supposed to be where he met the author Emerson at 95 years of age, wanting to share his story with the rest of the world, but didn't want it out until after he was gone. Which, after spending 28 years in the shove, then yeah, who can blame him? But that's the story of Olaf Hansen's supposed trip to the inner earth, where there is a big gaping hole at the North and South Pole that can be entered inside. Now, there is a lot of crazy stuff regarding the poles. You know, there's no flights over anywhere close to the North Pole. Antarctica is just trillions and trillions of dollars worth of coal and diamonds and oils, and nobody touches it. Supposedly, only scientific research goes down there. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the Germansies that probably went to Antarctica after the war, and a surprisingly large population in Argentina of, I guess, the B-listers that didn't get to make it to the show. I thought it was an interesting story. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make what you will of it. Static out.